The day they sold me on the courthouse steps, I wore my mother's dress and my father's shame. Clara Whitmore stood before a jeering crowd in a dying frontier town, watching her world collapse into dust and debt. The sheriff's voice rang out like a death sentence. Whoever bought her father's ranch would own her too. 5 years of labor, bound by law, sold like cattle. The townspeople laughed. No one bid. No one wanted her. Then a scarred stranger with cold eyes and calloused hands stepped forward and changed everything. Stay until the end. Hit like and comment your city. Let's see how far this story reaches across the world. The morning sun rose over Thornfield without mercy, turning the dusty streets into rivers of copper light and baking the wooden buildings until they creaked like old bones. Clara Whitmore walked those streets alone, her boots striking the hard-packed earth in a rhythm that sounded too much like a funeral march. She had dressed carefully that morning, her mother's gray dress with the pearl buttons, the one saved for special occasions, though there was nothing special about today, nothing except the end of everything she'd ever known. The courthouse loomed ahead, its white paint peeling like dead skin, its steps already crowded with the vultures who called themselves neighbors. Clara could hear their voices carrying on the hot wind, laughter sharp as broken glass, speculation eager as hunger. They had come to watch her fall. The whole damn town had come. Her hands trembled, and she clasped them together hard enough to hurt. The pain helped, gave her something to focus on besides the growing knot of dread in her stomach. "There she is, someone called out. "Big as a barn and twice as sturdy." Laughter rippled through the crowd like a sickness. Clara kept walking, kept her chin up and her eyes forward, fixed on some invisible point beyond the courthouse, beyond Thornfield, beyond this moment that was about to destroy her. Her father had taught her that much. How to take a blow without flinching, how to keep standing when everything inside you wanted to collapse. Thomas Whitmore had been dead 3 months now. 3 months since the fever took him, burning him up from the inside until there was nothing left but a body in a box and debts Clara hadn't known existed. The banker had come first, with his ledgers and his sympathetic face that couldn't quite hide his satisfaction. Then the lawyers shuffling papers and explaining in careful voices that the ranch, all 200 acres of it, would be sold to cover what her father owed. "And you, Miss Whitmore," the eldest lawyer had said, not quite meeting her eyes, "being unmarried and without family, and having resided on the property, well, there are provisions in the territorial law, provisions about debt inheritance and labor bonds." Clara had understood then. Understood with a clarity that felt like drowning. They were going to sell her with the land. 5 years. 5 years of her life, her labor, her freedom, bound to whoever had enough money and lack of conscience to buy a ranch that came with a woman attached like unwanted baggage. She reached the courthouse steps and stopped. The crowd parted slightly, creating a narrow path to the landing where Sheriff Hastings stood beside a small wooden table. He was arranging papers with the focused attention of a man who enjoyed his position far too much. When he looked up and saw Clara, his thin face split into a smile that made her skin crawl. "Miss Whitmore," he said loudly, projecting his voice so everyone could hear. "Prompt as always. Good to see some folks still have manners, even in their darkest hour." The laughter was louder this time, meaner. Clara climbed the steps. Each board groaned under her weight, a small humiliation she'd endured all her life. She was a big woman, built broad and tall like her father, with strong hands and stronger shoulders. In another world, another life. That might have been a blessing. Here, it was just one more thing for people to mock. "Hot day for a sale," Mrs. Pritchard said from the shade of the general store awning. She fanned herself dramatically, her voice carrying clear across the square. "Though I suppose we should be grateful. At least we'll get this unpleasantness over with quickly." "Unpleasantness," her companion echoed. "That's one word for it. Scandal's another." "It's not right," Mrs. Pritchard continued, louder now. "A young woman living alone on that ranch all these months. No supervision, no propriety. People talk, you know." "People always talk when there's something worth talking about," the other woman agreed. "I heard she's been wearing her father's old clothes. Trousers, if you can believe it. Trousers, heaven help us. Next she'll be chewing tobacco and spitting in the street." Their laughter was shrill and delighted, the sound of women who'd found someone lower than themselves to look down on. Clara felt heat crawl up her neck, into her cheeks. She kept her eyes forward, but her hands clenched tighter, nails biting into her palms. Sheriff Hastings cleared his throat importantly. All right, folks, let's get started. We're here today for the public auction of the Whitmore property, seized for unpaid debts owed by the late Thomas Whitmore. May he rest in peace. Amen, someone muttered, though it sounded more like mockery than prayer. Hastings shuffled his papers. The property consists of 200 acres of grazing land, one main house in need of repair, one barn, various outbuildings, livestock pens, and water rights to Blackstone Creek. There's also approximately 40 head of cattle, though I'm told they've gone somewhat wild in recent months. Like the woman tending them, a voice called out, followed by rough male laughter. Hastings allowed himself a small smile before continuing. Now, there is one additional condition attached to this sale, a rather unusual condition, but perfectly legal under territorial statute. The crowd leaned in. This was what they'd come for. Miss Clara Whitmore, being unmarried, without family, and party to her father's debts by virtue of residence and labor on the property, will be bound to the land for a period of 5 years. Whoever purchases the ranch will receive her labor, legally contracted and binding, for said period. The silence that followed was heavy and expectant. Clara could feel eyes crawling over her, assessing her worth the way you'd assess a horse at auction. Strong back, good teeth, probably eats too much. Now hold on, a rancher named Garrett spoke up. He was a big man with a red face and mean eyes. You're saying whoever buys the land gets the girl too, for 5 years? Her labor, Hastings corrected primly. 5 years of labor, room and board included in the purchase price. Labor, Garrett repeated, and the way he said it made Clara's stomach turn. What kind of labor are we talking about here, Sheriff? Whatever labor is required on a working ranch, Hastings said quickly. Cooking, cleaning, mending, livestock care, field work, all within the bounds of propriety, of course. Of course, Garrett said, but his grin suggested he had other ideas about propriety. How much does she eat? Another man called out. Woman that size could bankrupt a man in food costs alone. The crowd roared with laughter. Clara felt something inside her begin to crack. Not break, not yet, but develop thin fractures like ice under too much weight. She's strong, I'll give her that, someone else said. Probably pull a plow as good as an ox. Better hope she's got an ox's disposition too, another voice added, because she sure ain't got a woman's looks. More laughter, cruel and casual, the kind that came easy to people who'd never known real suffering. A woman's voice rose above the rest. Young, pretty Martha Tucker, who'd married the blacksmith's son and never let anyone forget her good fortune. I heard she tried to run the ranch herself after her daddy died. Can you imagine? A woman thinking she could manage a spread that size alone? That's the problem right there, Mrs. Pritchard declared. Girl's got ideas above her station. Thinks she's as good as a man just because she's built like one. Should have married when she had the chance, Martha said. Should have found a husband to take care of her proper. But no one wanted her then, and I can't imagine anyone wants her now. The words landed like stones, each one carefully aimed, each one finding its mark. Clara's vision blurred. She blinked hard, furious with herself for even coming close to tears. She would not cry, would not give them that satisfaction. Hastings tapped the table for attention. Ladies and gentlemen, if we could return to the business at hand, I'm prepared to open bidding at $800. That covers the outstanding debts, legal fees, and includes the land, buildings, livestock, and Miss Whitmore's labor for 5 years. Very reasonable price for a working ranch. Silence. Not the expectant kind this time. The kind that said nobody was interested. Hastings frowned. Come now. This is prime grazing land we're talking about. Good water access. Solid barn. $800 is a bargain. Nothing. A horse stamped its feet somewhere in the crowd. A baby cried, the sound thin and irritable in the heat. The sun beat down relentlessly, and Clara felt sweat trickling down her spine, soaking into her mother's good dress. 700, Hastings tried, and now there was an edge to his voice. $700 for the whole property. That's less than $4 an acre, folks. You won't find a better deal. Still nothing. The girl included? Garrett called out. 5 years of her labor, guaranteed? That's right, Hastings confirmed. Garrett stroked his beard thoughtfully. And if she proves unsatisfactory, if she's lazy or defiant or just plain useless, can I send her back? The contract is binding on both parties, Hastings said carefully, but there are provisions for disciplinary measures within reason. Within reason, Garrett repeated slowly, considering. Then he shook his head. Still not worth it. I got 3 sons who eat like locusts. Can't afford to feed a grown woman on top of that, especially one built like a draft horse. The laughter was getting old now, worn thin by repetition, but it still hurt. 600, Hastings said, and desperation was creeping into his voice. $600. Final offer. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. This had been entertaining when it was a spectacle, but now it was just sad. Pathetic, even. A woman nobody wanted and land nobody would buy. I wouldn't take her for free, someone muttered. Probably haunted anyway, another voice added. Thomas Whitmore died in that house. Place has bad luck written all over it. Clara felt the cracks inside her deepen. She had known this might happen, had spent sleepless nights imagining this exact scenario, but knowing and experiencing were such different things. The reality of standing here, unwanted and unloved, while her neighbors picked apart her worth like crows on a carcass. It was worse than anything she'd imagined. Hastings looked genuinely annoyed now. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm required by law to conduct this auction. If there are no bids, the property will revert to the Territorial Bank, and Miss Whitmore will be remanded to... I'll take it. The voice came from the back of the crowd, low and rough as gravel scraped over iron. It wasn't loud, but it carried with absolute authority, cutting through the noise like a blade through silk. The crowd went silent. Clara turned, her heart suddenly hammering in her chest. A man stood at the edge of the gathering, half in shadow despite the bright sun. He was tall, taller than any man Clara had seen, easily 6.5 feet, with shoulders that seemed to block out the sky behind him. His clothes were worn but clean. Dark pants, a faded blue shirt, a leather vest that had seen years of hard use. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face. But as he stepped forward into the light, Clara caught her first clear look at him. The crowd parted without thinking, creating a path. Nobody moved to block him. Nobody even breathed too loud. His face was hard and weathered, carved by wind and sun and something else. Something that went deeper than weather. A long scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a pale line against tanned skin. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale gray and absolutely cold. He moved with the economy of a man who'd learned to waste nothing, not motion, not words, not energy. He walked toward the courthouse steps like he owned every inch of ground he crossed. Clara's breath caught. She'd never seen him before, didn't know his name, his history, anything about him, but something in the way he moved, patient and implacable as a glacier, made her pulse race. Hastings recovered first, his professional instincts kicking in despite his obvious surprise. "And you are, sir?" "Dane Callahan." The man's voice matched everything else about him, rough and spare and utterly certain. "Mr. Callahan," Hastings said, trying to regain control of the situation. "You're interested in the property." "I'll buy it." "The full price? $600 plus legal fees and the labor contract with Miss Whitmore?" Callahan reached into his vest without answering. He pulled out a worn leather pouch and mounted the courthouse steps with the same deliberate stride. The boards didn't groan under his weight. They accepted it, the way stone accepts stone. He reached the table where Hastings stood and upended the pouch. Gold coins spilled across the wood, catching the sunlight and throwing it back in bright, defiant flashes. The crowd gasped collectively. Hastings stared at the money, his eyes widening. His thin fingers darted forward, counting quickly, his lips moving with the numbers. "This is, Mr. Callahan, this is $900. You've overpaid by—" "Keep it," Callahan said flatly, "for your trouble." Hastings' face split into a grin so wide it looked painful. Well, that's very generous, sir. Very generous indeed." He shuffled through his papers with renewed energy, found the deed, and slid it across the table along with a pen. "If you'll just sign here, the property is yours. All of it, including the terms we discussed regarding Miss Whitmore's labor." Callahan picked up the pen. He didn't read the document, didn't hesitate, didn't ask questions. Just signed his name in a quick, brutal slash of ink across paper. Hastings beamed. Congratulations, Mr. Callahan. You are now the legal owner of the Whitmore Ranch and all properties and contracts therein. He shot a triumphant look at Clara, unable to resist twisting the knife, including 5 years of Miss Whitmore's bonded labor. The crowd had started whispering again, confused and uncertain. This wasn't how the story was supposed to go. The stranger wasn't supposed to buy. Clara wasn't supposed to be wanted. Callahan folded the deed carefully and tucked it into his vest. Then he turned and looked directly at Clara for the first time. His eyes were unreadable. Not cruel. She'd seen cruelty enough today to recognize it, but not kind either. Just flat and assessing, taking her measure the way a carpenter measures wood before cutting. "Get in the wagon," he said. Clara blinked. The words didn't make sense. "What?" "The wagon." He gestured toward a sturdy buckboard parked at the edge of the square, hitched to a pair of bay horses. "Get in." She stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. This man, this stranger, had just bought her father's ranch. Bought her. And now he was giving her orders like she was nothing more than livestock he'd acquired. Callahan waited exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked toward the wagon without looking back, his boots striking the ground in that same patient, inevitable rhythm. The crowd watched in stunned silence. Hastings chuckled, breaking the spell. "Better do as the man says, Miss Whitmore. He owns you now, fair and square, legal and binding." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Owned. 5 years of her life, signed away on a piece of paper, delivered into the hands of a man she'd never met. But what choice did she have? The alternative was the bank, and whatever provisions Hastings had been about to describe before Callahan interrupted. She'd heard stories about women remanded to territorial workhouses, about labor camps where debt servants disappeared into mines and lumber operations and never came back. At least the ranch was familiar ground. At least she'd be home. Clara descended the courthouse steps on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The crowd parted again, but differently this time. Not laughing now, just watching with a mixture of pity and fascination as she walked toward the wagon and the stranger who'd bought her. She reached the buckboard just as Callahan finished checking the harness. His hands moved over the leather straps with practiced efficiency, testing each connection, adjusting the bits in the horses' mouths. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence. Clara grabbed the side of the wagon and pulled herself up onto the bench seat, her face burning. The dress made it awkward. She was used to climbing in pants, the way she'd done when her father was alive. But she managed. Callahan swung up beside her a moment later. He gathered the reins, clicked his tongue softly, and the horses moved forward. They left Thornfield in silence. Clara sat rigid on the hard bench, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white against the gray fabric of her dress. She stared straight ahead, refusing to look back at the town, at the people who'd gathered to watch her humiliation. The main street gave way to the north road. Buildings thinned and disappeared. Soon there was nothing but open country, rolling hills covered in brown summer grass, scattered cottonwoods marking the creek beds, and the endless sky pressing down like blue weight. Clara knew this road, had traveled it hundreds of times with her father, hauling supplies from town, driving cattle to market, making the journey that connected their isolated ranch to the rest of the world. Every rock, every turning, every landmark was familiar, but it all felt different now, foreign somehow. Wrong. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clop of hooves on packed earth. 5 minutes passed, and 20. Finally, Clara couldn't stand it anymore. "Why did you do it?" The words came out harsher than she'd intended, sharp with confusion and anger and fear, all tangled together. Callahan didn't look at her, kept his eyes on the road, his hand steady on the reins. "Do what?" "Buy the ranch. Buy me." The last word stuck in her throat like glass. "Needed land." "There's land everywhere out here," Clara said. "Cheaper land, better land, land that doesn't come with complications." "Complications," Callahan repeated, his tone absolutely neutral. "A woman you have to feed and house for 5 years whether you want to or not," Clara said bitterly. "A woman the whole town just made clear isn't worth the air she breathes." "The town's wrong about a lot of things." Clara turned to look at him, really look at him. The scar on his face was old, fully healed, the kind of mark that told stories a man probably didn't want to share. His hands on the reins were scarred too, knuckles that had been broken and healed crooked, calluses so thick they looked like armor. This was a man who knew hard work and harder living. "You don't know me," she said quietly. "Don't know anything about me. For all you know, everything they said back there is true, that I'm lazy or useless or— Are you?" The question stopped her cold. "What? Are you lazy?" Callahan asked, still not looking at her. "Are you useless?" Clara's jaw tightened. "No. Then why would I care what they think?" The logic was so simple, so direct, that it momentarily robbed her of speech. "You know the land?" Callahan continued in that same level tone. "Know the work that needs doing?" "I grew up on that ranch," Clara said. "I know every acre, every fence line, every head of cattle. My father taught me everything. I can rope, brand, mend fence, birth calves, read weather, fix equipment." She stopped herself, suddenly aware she was defending her worth to a man who'd already bought it. "Good," Callahan said simply. "Then you'll be useful." They rode in silence for another mile. Clara's mind churned with questions she couldn't quite form into words. Finally, she tried again. But why pay so much? $900 when they were asking $6. Wanted it done. But didn't want you standing there any longer than necessary, Callahan said, and for the first time there was something in his voice besides flat neutrality. Not quite emotion, but something close to it. Didn't want them having any more time to— He stopped himself. Wanted it done. Clara fell silent, processing that. This man, this stranger, had paid extra money, significant money, to end her public humiliation faster. Not because he cared about her necessarily, but because— What? Because it was decent? Because he understood what it felt like? "You said something," she ventured carefully. "Back in town. You said you know what it's like to be sold." Callahan's jaw tightened. The muscles worked under the weathered skin, and for a moment Clara thought he wasn't going to answer. "I do," he said finally. "How?" "Same way most people get sold. Had something someone wanted, couldn't pay what I owed. Worked 3 years in a logging camp in Oregon to clear the debt." Clara's breath caught. She'd heard of such places. Brutal operations where men worked until they broke or died, whichever came first. "How old were you?" 16. 16, just a boy, younger than Clara was now. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Don't be. Made me strong. Taught me what matters." He glanced at her briefly, those cold gray eyes meeting hers for just a moment. "Taught me that a contract doesn't define a person, just their circumstances." Clara didn't know what to say to that, didn't know if there was anything to say. They crested the final hill, and there, spread out in the valley below like a broken promise, was the ranch. Clara's heart sank. She'd known it was bad. 3 months of neglect had taken their toll. But seeing it now, through Callahan's eyes, seeing it as the property he'd just paid $900 for, it looked like something defeated. The main house sagged in the middle like a dying animal. Shingles were missing from the roof in a dozen places. The porch listed dangerously to one side, boards rotted through, railing broken. One shutter hung by a single hinge, banging occasionally in the wind. The windows were so filthy they looked like blind eyes. The barn was worse. Its great doors stood open, one hanging crooked, and she could see daylight through gaps in the walls. The hayloft looked ready to collapse. The windmill stood frozen, its blades locked in place by rust or damage. The corrals were a disaster of broken rails and collapsed posts. The vegetable garden her father had planted every spring was nothing but weeds now. Even the path from the road to the house was overgrown, barely visible. Callahan pulled the wagon to a stop and sat there for a long moment, taking it all in. Clara waited for the anger, the recriminations, the accusation that she'd let everything fall apart, that she was as useless as the town said. Instead, Callahan just nodded slowly. "How long since your father died?" 3 months, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And you've been here alone since then?" "Yes." "Trying to keep it together?" "Trying," Clara agreed. But there was no money for repairs, no money for anything. I sold what cattle I could catch, but prices were low and she stopped, swallowing hard. I tried. I tried so hard, but it wasn't enough. Callahan was quiet for a moment. Then he set the brake and wrapped the reins. House first, he said. Need to see if it's livable. He climbed down from the wagon with that same unhurried efficiency. Clara followed, her legs stiff from the long ride. Together they walked to the house. The door stuck when Callahan pushed it, swollen with moisture and neglect. He put his shoulder into it, a casual application of strength, and it gave way with a groan that sounded almost human. The interior made Clara want to cry. Dust covered everything like a burial shroud. Cobwebs draped the corners in thick curtains. The furniture her father had built, the table where they'd eaten every meal, the chairs where they'd sat by the fire, the shelves that had held her mother's few precious things, stood like ghosts in the dim light. The fireplace was cold and dead, filled with months of ash. The windows barely let in light through their coating of grime. The floor was gritty with tracked-in dirt and the debris of abandonment. This was where Clara had grown up, where her father had taught her to read by firelight, where they'd shared meals and stories and the quiet comfort of family. All gone now. Callahan moved through the space methodically, checking walls, testing floorboards, examining the ceiling beams. He disappeared into the back rooms, her father's bedroom, her own small room, and Clara heard him opening doors, testing shutters. He returned a few minutes later. "Structure's sound," he said. "Foundation's good. Roof needs work, but it's not critical yet. House is salvageable." Clara nodded numbly. "Tools?" Callahan asked. "Barn. Same place my father always kept them." "Get them. We'll start with the porch before someone puts a foot through and breaks a leg." Clara stared at him. "Now? You want to start now?" "Daylight's burning," Callahan said, already heading back outside. "And there's work to do." He didn't wait for her agreement, just walked out like it was settled. Clara stood in the dusty silence of her father's house, Callahan's house now, and felt something shift deep inside her. Not acceptance, not even resignation, but something else, something that felt almost like the faintest spark of possibility. She went to the barn and found the tools exactly where they'd always been. Hammer, saw, nails, crowbar, all the things her father had used to build and maintain this place. Her hands knew their weight, their balance, familiar things in an unfamiliar world. When she returned to the house, Callahan had already started pulling up rotten boards from the porch. He worked with the focused efficiency of someone who'd done this work 1,000 times, wasting no motion, making no fuss. Clara set down the tools and picked up the crowbar. Without speaking, she moved to the opposite end of the porch and began pulling nails from the damaged boards. They worked in silence as the sun climbed higher and the heat settled over them like a blanket. Sweat soaked through Clara's dress. Her muscles burned. Her hands, soft from 3 months of despair, started to blister. But she kept working. And Callahan, true to his word, didn't mock her, didn't criticize, just worked beside her, occasionally handing her a tool or taking a board she'd loosened, acknowledging her presence through action rather than words. As the afternoon wore on and the pile of rotten wood grew and the porch slowly began to take shape again, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Useful. The sun was sinking toward the western hills when Callahan finally straightened and surveyed their work. They'd cleared all the damaged boards and replaced about half of them with sound lumber Callahan had found stacked in the barn. "That'll do for today," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Need to see about food." Food. Clara's stomach clenched. She hadn't eaten since early morning, and even then it had only been some stale bread. She opened her mouth to say something, what she wasn't sure, but Callahan was already heading toward the wagon. He returned carrying a canvas pack. From it he pulled jerky, hardtack, and a canteen of water. He handed half of everything to Clara without comment. They sat on the partially repaired porch steps and ate in silence as the light faded and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The food was simple, tough, not enough to truly fill the emptiness in Clara's stomach, but it was something. When they finished, Callahan stood and gathered the tools. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight. You take the house." Clara blinked. The house has 2 bedrooms. You could— Barn's fine, Callahan said flatly. House is yours. Before Clara could respond, he'd picked up the tools and was walking toward the barn, his tall figure gradually being swallowed by the gathering darkness. Clara sat alone on the porch steps, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch at night, wind in the cottonwoods, the distant call of an owl, the creak of old wood settling. She was exhausted, filthy. Her hands hurt and her back ached, and she had no idea what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time since her father died, she wasn't alone. And that, Clara realized as she finally stood and made her way into the dark house, was something. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had that morning when she walked toward the courthouse in her mother's gray dress, expecting nothing but shame. It was a beginning, however small, however uncertain. It was a beginning. Clara woke to darkness and the sound of hammering. For a confused moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling above her was wrong, too low, too close. The air smelled of dust and abandonment. Then memory crashed back like a wave and she remembered everything. The auction, the crowd, the stranger with cold eyes who'd bought her father's ranch, and her along with it. She sat up in her narrow bed, her body protesting every movement. Her hands throbbed where blisters had formed during yesterday's work. Her shoulders ached. Her back felt like someone had beaten it with a board. The hammering continued, steady and rhythmic, coming from somewhere outside. Clara pushed herself out of bed and stumbled to the window. Dawn was just breaking, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. In the yard below, she could see Callahan working on the porch by lamplight, replacing the last of the damaged boards. He moved with the same unhurried efficiency she'd witnessed yesterday, each hammer strike precise and measured. She had no idea how long he'd been awake, how long he'd been working while she slept. Clara dressed quickly in one of her father's old shirts and a pair of work pants, the clothes the town had mocked her for wearing, the clothes that actually made sense for the work ahead. Her mother's gray dress hung on a peg, already showing the dirt and sweat of yesterday. She'd wash it later, put it away. She wouldn't need it again. When she stepped outside, Callahan glanced up briefly, then returned to his hammering without comment. The morning air was cool, almost cold, carrying the promise of another hot day to come. "Morning," Clara said, her voice still rough with sleep. Callahan drove one final nail home, tested the board with his weight, then straightened. "Coffee's in the barn. Made it an hour ago. Probably still hot." Clara found a dented pot sitting on a flat stone near the barn entrance. A small fire burned down to coals beside it. She poured herself a cup using a tin mug that had seen better days. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, bitter and black, but it was warm and it was real, and she drank it gratefully. When she returned to the porch, Callahan was gathering his tools. "Porch is done," he said. "Barn's next. Doors need rehinging, and there's rot in the east wall that needs replacing before winter." Clara nodded, taking another sip of the harsh coffee. "What do you need me to do?" "House," Callahan said, jerking his chin toward the door behind her. "Needs cleaning, top to bottom. Can't live in that much dust and dirt." Something in Clara bristled at the order, at being told to clean while he did the real work. But she swallowed the protest. This was the bargain, wasn't it? 5 years of labor, whatever was required. And the house did need cleaning, desperately. "All right," she said. Callahan picked up his tools and headed toward the barn. Clara watched him go, then turned and faced the house that had been her home and was now her prison. Or maybe her salvation. She still wasn't sure which. Inside, the morning light streaming through the filthy windows only made the devastation more obvious. Claire stood in the main room and tried to remember where to even begin. The dust was so thick in places it had drifted like snow. The cobwebs hung in layers. The floor was gritty with tracked-in dirt. She started with the windows, found rags in a chest her father had kept near the fireplace, old shirts torn into cleaning cloths, still there after all these months. She hauled water from the creek in a bucket with a slow leak, made a dozen trips before she had enough to work with. Then she started scrubbing. The first window took an hour. When she finally stepped back, her arms aching and her hands raw, she could actually see through the glass. Real sunlight poured in, revealing just how bad the rest of the room looked. Clara worked through the morning in a kind of trance. Window by window, surface by surface, she attacked the accumulated grime of months. She swept the floor, raising clouds of dust that made her cough. She scrubbed the table her father had built, revealing the warm wood beneath years of use and weeks of neglect. She knocked down the cobwebs with a broom, then swept them out the door along with the dust and the debris and the physical evidence of her failure to maintain this place alone. By midday, her hands were bleeding. The blisters from yesterday had broken during the morning's work, leaving raw patches that screamed every time she gripped the rag or the broom handle. Clara wrapped them in strips torn from an old pillowcase, but the makeshift bandages quickly soaked through with blood and water. She kept working. The main room slowly transformed. The windows gleamed. The floor showed its original color. The furniture stood clean and solid, ready to be used again. But there was still the fireplace to clean out, the shelves to scrub, the 2 bedrooms to tackle. Clara moved to the fireplace and began scooping out months of accumulated ash. The work was filthy, coating her hands and arms in gray powder, making her cough when she breathed too deep. Sweat ran down her face, leaving clean tracks through the grime. She was so focused on the work that she didn't hear Callahan approach until he spoke from directly behind her. "When did you eat last?" Clara jumped, nearly dropping the ash bucket. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his shirt soaked with sweat, wood shavings caught in his hair. "What?" she asked, her mind still half focused on the fireplace. "Food," Callahan said patiently. "When did you eat last?" Clara had to think about it. The jerky last night. Before that, the stale bread yesterday morning before the auction. "Last night," she said, "with you, on the porch." "That was 18 hours ago." Clara looked at him blankly. "I've been working." "Can't work on an empty stomach," Callahan said. He gestured toward the door. "Come on." "But I'm not finished. The fireplace still needs... It can wait." "You can't." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to prove that she could push through, that she was strong enough, that she didn't need coddling. But her stomach chose that moment to clench painfully, reminding her just how empty it was. She followed Callahan outside. He'd set up a makeshift camp near the barn, a small fire pit, a couple of logs arranged as seats, his pack and bedroll stowed neatly under the overhang. From his pack he pulled more jerky, some dried apples, and a chunk of hard cheese wrapped in cloth. They sat on the logs and ate in silence. The food was simple, tough, but Clara's body accepted it gratefully. The cheese especially, rich and salty and substantial, in a way the jerky wasn't. "You're bleeding," Callahan observed, nodding toward her wrapped hands. Clara looked down at the makeshift bandages, now thoroughly stained. "It's nothing, just blisters." "Let me see." It wasn't a request. Clara hesitated, then unwrapped the cloths. Her palms looked like raw meat. The blisters had broken and torn, leaving open sores that wept clear fluid mixed with blood. Dirt had gotten into the wounds during the cleaning, leaving them inflamed and angry. Callahan studied them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stood and went to his pack, returning with a small tin and a clean cloth. "Give me your hands," he said. Clara extended them reluctantly. Callahan uncapped the tin, some kind of salve, thick and greenish, and began applying it to her wounds with surprising gentleness. His own hands, she noticed, were covered in old scars and fresh cuts. Working hands, hands that understood pain. The salve burned at first, then cooled, bringing relief Clara hadn't expected. "What is it?" she asked. "Comfrey and golden seal, old logging camp remedy." He wrapped her hands in clean strips of cloth from his pack, creating proper bandages this time. "Keep them clean. Change the wrapping twice a day." "Thank you," Clara said quietly. Callahan just nodded and returned to his food. They finished eating as the sun climbed toward its peak. The heat was building again, turning the ranch yard into a furnace. "House is looking better," Callahan said, surprising Clara. She hadn't thought he'd noticed. "Still a lot to do," she replied. "Always is. But you're making progress." He stood and brushed crumbs from his pants. "I'm going to work on the barn doors. You should rest." "I can help with the doors. I know how to—" "You're exhausted," Callahan interrupted, his tone flat but not unkind. "And your hands need time to heal. Rest now. There'll be plenty of work tomorrow." He walked away before she could protest. Clara sat on the log and watched him go. frustration and something else, gratitude maybe, or confusion, warring inside her. This man had bought her, owned her labor for 5 years. By all rights, he should be driving her until she dropped, extracting every ounce of work from his investment. Instead, he was telling her to rest. She didn't understand him at all, but she was tired, more tired than she'd realized. The combination of physical exhaustion, hunger satisfied, and hands that no longer screamed with every movement pulled at her like a current. Clara returned to the house, intending to just sit for a moment on one of the newly cleaned chairs. She woke to darkness and the smell of cooking meat. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure how she'd gotten from the chair to her bed. Then she noticed the quilt tucked around her father's old quilt, the one that had been stored in the cedar chest. Someone had carried her to bed. Someone had covered her. Clara's cheeks burned as she realized what must have happened. She'd fallen asleep in the chair, passed out from exhaustion, and Callahan had found her, had carried her to her room like a child unable to care for itself. The humiliation was almost worse than the auction. She pushed herself out of bed, noting that someone had also removed her boots. The bandages on her hands were clean and white. He must have changed them while she slept. Outside, full darkness had fallen. Stars blazed overhead in the clear frontier sky. Near the barn, a campfire burned, and Callahan sat beside it tending something that sizzled in a pan. Clara approached slowly, her stomach twisting with embarrassment. Callahan glanced up as she neared. Awake. "I'm sorry," Clara said immediately. "I didn't mean to fall asleep. I was just going to rest for a minute and then—" "You needed sleep," Callahan interrupted. "Got it. Nothing to apologize for." "But I was supposed to be working. I wasted half the day." "You worked for 7 hours straight on no food and torn up hands," Callahan said, his tone matter of fact. "Then your body shut down because you pushed it past its limit. That's not wasting time. That's learning where the limit is." Clara fell silent, not sure how to respond to that. "Sit," Callahan said, gesturing to the other log. "Food's almost ready." Clara sat. In the pan, 2 rabbits were cooking, skinned and spitted, fat dripping into the flames with sharp hisses. The smell made her mouth water. "Where did you get rabbits?" she asked. "Snared them this afternoon, found tracks near the creek." He pulled the spit from the fire and examined the meat critically. "Good land. Plenty of game if you know where to look." He divided the rabbit between 2 tin plates and handed one to Clara, along with a knife. The meat was hot enough to burn her fingers even through the bandages, but she didn't care. She ate like she was starving, which she realized she essentially was. Callahan ate with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything else. When they'd both finished, he produced 2 apples from somewhere and tossed one to Clara. They ate the apples in silence, watching the fire burn down to coals. "Tomorrow," Callahan said eventually, "we start on the barn. Need both of us for the door work." Clara nodded. "What about the house? I didn't finish." "House is good enough for now. Barn's more urgent. Can't store equipment or animals if the walls are falling down." "All right." "You know carpentry?" Callahan asked. "Real work, not just cleaning?" "My father taught me," Clara said. "I can measure, cut, nail, mortise. I've helped rebuild fence sections, repair roof beams. I'm not as fast as someone with more practice, but I know what I'm doing." Callahan nodded, seeming satisfied. "Good. We'll make a team then." A team. The word settled over Clara like a blanket. Not owner and servant, not master and bond laborer. A team. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said before she could stop herself. Callahan looked at her, waiting. "Why aren't you—" She struggled to find the right words. "Why aren't you treating me like the others would have? Like Garrett or any of those men in town? They would have worked me until I collapsed and then worked me some more. Would have made sure I knew my place." Callahan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "You know what I learned in that logging camp?" he said finally. "Learned that when you treat people like animals, they either break or they bite. Either way, you don't get good work. You get revenge, waiting to happen." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending up a small shower of sparks. "I don't need broken or bitter," he continued. "I need this ranch working. Need the land productive. Can't do that alone. So we work together. Simple as that." Nothing about this is simple, Clara said quietly. No, Callahan agreed, but it's practical, and practical works when simple doesn't. Clara absorbed that, turning it over in her mind. This man saw her as a resource, yes, but not a disposable one. Not something to be used up and discarded. More like a tool worth maintaining, a horse worth feeding properly so it could pull its weight. It wasn't friendship, it wasn't even kindness, really. But it was more than she'd expected, more than she'd feared. I'll work hard, she said, the words coming out almost like a promise. I'll earn what you paid. Callahan met her eyes across the fire. I know you will. The next morning, they started on the barn before the sun cleared the eastern hills. Callahan had already assessed the damage and formed a plan. The east wall had 3 boards completely rotted through and another half dozen that were questionable. The main doors had pulled free from their top hinges and would need to be remounted. The hayloft ladder was missing 2 rungs. They started with the wall. Callahan measured and marked while Clara hauled lumber from the stack they'd found weathering behind the barn. Old boards her father must have salvaged from some previous project. Some were good, some were marginal, but there was enough to work with. Cut here and here, Callahan said, marking lines with a piece of chalk. Need them exact. No more than a 1/4-inch variance or they won't sit right. Clara took the saw he offered and got to work. The saw was old but sharp, and the rhythm of cutting was familiar. Pull back, push forward, feel the teeth bite into wood. She'd done this with her father dozens of times. The muscle memory was still there. Callahan worked beside her using a pry bar to remove the rotted boards without damaging the frame. They worked in comfortable silence. The only sounds, the rasp of the saw, and the squeal of nails being pulled free. By midday, they'd replaced 4 boards and were working on the 5th when Clara's saw blade caught on a knot and jumped the line, ruining the cut. Damn it, she muttered, examining the board. It was off by nearly an inch, unusable for the precise fit they needed. She expected anger, expected criticism, expected the kind of sharp reprimand her father used to deliver when she made mistakes as a child. Callahan just looked at the board, then at her. Knots are tricky. Always start the cut on the far side and work back toward them. Gives you more control. He took another board from the stack and marked it. Try again. Clara did. This time, following his advice, the saw moved smoothly even through the knot. The cut was clean and straight. Better, Callahan said. Not praise exactly, just acknowledgement. They mounted the new board together, Callahan holding it in place while Clara drove the nails. Her hand still hurt, but the salve and proper bandaging had helped. The blisters were scabbing over, starting to heal. You're good with a hammer, Callahan observed as she sank the final nail flush in a single stroke. My father used to say I had an honest swing, Clara replied. Said some people try to muscle it, but that's not how it works. It's all in the wrist and the timing. Your father taught you well. The words were simple, but they hit Clara unexpectedly hard. No one had acknowledged that before. The town only saw a woman trying to do man's work, making a mockery of herself. They never saw the skill, the knowledge, the years of patient teaching that had gone into her education. He did, Clara said, her throat tight. He really did. They finished the wall as the sun reached its peak, then broke for the midday meal. Callahan had shot another rabbit that morning, and they roasted it over the campfire along with some wild onions he'd found near the creek. You know this land well, Clara said, watching him tend the fire with practiced ease. The game trails, the plants, but you're not from around here. No, Callahan agreed. Oregon originally. Drifted down through California, spent time in Nevada. Worked wherever there was work. What brought you here? To Thornfield? Callahan turned the spit, making sure the meat cooked evenly. Heard there was cheap land available. Figured it was time to settle. Stop drifting. Why this ranch specifically? He was quiet for a moment. Location's good, water access, decent grazing, room to grow. It was a practical answer, but Clara sensed there was more he wasn't saying. She let it go. They ate, then returned to work on the barn doors. This was heavier work, requiring both of them. The doors were solid oak, built to last, but they weighed as much as a small horse. Getting them off the broken hinges, laying them flat to work on, then rehanging them on new hardware, It took strength and coordination. "On three," Callahan said, gripping one end while Clara took the other. "1, 2, 3. They lifted together. Clara's shoulders screamed in protest, but she held her end steady as they maneuvered the door away from the frame and lowered it carefully to the ground. "Good," Callahan said. "Other one now." They repeated the process with the second door. By the time both were down, Clara was sweating through her shirt and her arms were shaking. Callahan examined the old hinges, frowning. "These are finished, rusted through, need new ones." "There might be some in my father's tool chest," Clara said. "He kept hardware from every project, never threw anything away." She found the chest in the corner of the barn, half buried under old tack and broken equipment. Inside was exactly what she'd remembered, a jumbled collection of nails, screws, hinges, latches, and other hardware her father had salvaged over the years. Clara sorted through it, finding 4 heavy iron hinges that looked like they'd work. They were old but solid, the kind of hardware built to last generations. "These should do it," she said, carrying them to where Callahan was working. He examined them critically, testing the pins, checking for cracks. "They'll work." "Good eye." Together they mounted the new hinges on the doors, making sure everything was level and aligned. It was precise work, requiring patience and attention to detail. Clara held the door steady while Callahan drove the mounting screws, then they switched positions for the second door. The sun was low on the western horizon by the time they were ready to rehang the doors. This was the hardest part, lifting the massive oak panels while simultaneously threading the hinge pins into place. "This takes timing," Callahan said. "I'll count. We lift on 3, hold on 4, and I'll slide the pin on 5. Got it?" Clara nodded, gripping her end of the door. 1, 2, 3. They lifted. Clara's entire body strained with the effort. 4. She held, muscles quivering, sweat stinging her eyes. 5. She heard the metallic slide of the pin going home, then felt the weight shift as the hinge took the load. "Down easy," Callahan said. They lowered the door carefully, making sure it hung true. When they stepped back, it swung smoothly on its new hardware, opening and closing with barely a sound. "Perfect," Callahan said, and there was satisfaction in his voice. They hung the second door as twilight was falling, working by the last of the daylight. When it was done, Clara stood back and looked at their work. The barn still needed more repairs, but it had doors again. Real doors that closed and latched. It was starting to look like a building instead of a ruin. "We did good work today," Callahan said, echoing her thoughts. Clara realized it was true. They had done good work, together, as a team. That night, after another meal by the campfire, Clara returned to the house while Callahan settled in the barn. She lit a lamp and looked around the main room, clean windows, swept floor, furniture dusted and ready for use. It still wasn't finished, but it was livable. Home, almost. She checked her hands before bed. The blisters were definitely healing, new skin forming over the raw patches. In a few more days, they'd be tough enough for more work. Her body was adapting, getting stronger. Clara lay in her narrow bed and listened to the night sounds of the ranch. Wind in the eaves, the distant yip of coyotes, the creak of the barn as it settled. And somewhere in that darkness, a man who'd paid $900 for a broken ranch and the woman who came with it. A man who worked beside her instead of over her, who taught instead of commanded, who saw her as useful instead of worthless. Clara still didn't fully understand Dane Callahan, didn't know what drove him or what he wanted beyond getting the ranch working again. But she was beginning to trust him. And in a world that had sold her like livestock just days ago, trust felt like water in the desert, precious and sustaining and absolutely necessary for survival. Tomorrow, they would work on the corrals. After that, the fence line, then the garden, then 100 other tasks that needed doing before winter came. It would be hard work, exhausting work that would push her to her limits and maybe beyond. But Clara found herself looking forward to it, because for the first time in months, maybe years, she felt like she was building something instead of watching everything fall apart. And that, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, was worth more than all the gold Callahan had paid on those courthouse steps. It was worth everything. The days blurred into weeks, each one marked by calluses growing thicker and muscles growing harder. Clara woke before dawn now, her body adjusting to the rhythm Callahan set without words. They worked through the cool mornings, rested during the brutal midday heat, then pushed through until twilight painted the sky purple and gold. The corrals came together first. New posts sunk deep where old ones had rotted. Rails split from logs Callahan felled in the cottonwood grove near the creek. Clara learned to use the maul, swinging it overhead and driving wedges into the wood until it split clean. Her shoulders burned with the work, but the burn felt good now, felt like progress. "Tighter on that bottom rail," Callahan said one morning, checking her work. "Cattle will test it. Need it solid." Clara adjusted the placement and drove the nails deeper. When she finished, Callahan tested it with his full weight, leaning hard. The rail held without a creak. "That'll do," he said, and those 2 words had become praise enough. They moved to the fence line next, walking the entire perimeter of the property. 200 acres meant miles of fencing, and what they found was a disaster. Posts leaning at drunken angles, wire rusted through or missing entirely. Whole sections collapsed into the grass. "This'll take months," Clara said, staring at the devastation. "Then we'd better start now," Callahan replied, already pulling tools from the pack he carried. They worked in sections, replacing the worst areas first. Callahan taught her to dig post holes properly, deep enough to survive the freeze-thaw cycles of winter. Showed her how to string wire tight without breaking it, how to splice broken sections, how to recognize when a post was still good despite its lean. Clara's hands, healed from the initial blisters, developed new calluses. Thick pads of toughened skin formed across her palms and at the base of each finger. Her arms grew corded with muscle. Her back straightened under loads that would have broken her a month ago. She was becoming someone different, someone stronger. One afternoon, as they worked on a particularly stubborn section of fence, Callahan spoke without looking up from his digging. "You move different now." Clara paused in her wire stringing. "What do you mean?" "When you first got here, you moved like you were apologizing for taking up space. Now you move like you own the ground you're standing on." Clara considered that. He was right. She no longer hunched her shoulders or tried to make herself smaller. When she walked, she walked. When she worked, she worked. No apology, no shame. "The town made me feel like I was too much," she said quietly. "Too big, too strong, too everything except what I should be." "The town's full of fools," Callahan said flatly. He drove his shovel deep into the earth, leveraging out a rock. "Strong is useful. The rest is just noise." That evening, as they ate rabbit stew Clara had learned to make from the vegetables now growing in the replanted garden, she found herself studying Callahan across the campfire. He was a man of few words, but the words he spoke carried weight. He never wasted breath on empty phrases or false comfort. When he said something, he meant it. "Where did you learn all this?" Clara asked. "The ranching, the building, all of it?" Callahan swirled the stew in his bowl. "Logging camps taught me woodwork. Construction crews after that. Spent a year on a cattle drive north from Texas. That's where I learned livestock. Worked a homestead in Oregon for a season before the owner died. Picked up bits everywhere I went." "You've done a lot of different work." "Had to. When you're bonded labor, you work whatever job they assign you. Learn fast or suffer. I learned fast." Clara absorbed that. 3 years in a logging camp starting at 16. How many other jobs after that? How many places where he'd been nothing more than a pair of hands and a strong back? "Do you have family?" she asked. "Anyone you left behind?" Callahan's face went carefully neutral. "Had a sister once, younger. She was 7 when they took me to the camps. Don't know what happened to her after." The pain in those simple words was like a fist around Clara's heart. "I'm sorry." "Long time ago." He stood abruptly, gathering his bowl. "I'll check the stock before dark. You should rest." He walked away before Clara could respond, his tall figure disappearing into the gathering shadows near the barn. That night, lying in her bed, Clara thought about the man sleeping in the barn, thought about a 16-year-old boy torn from his family and sold into brutal labor, thought about a 7-year-old girl left behind, her fate unknown. No wonder he'd understood what it meant to stand on those courthouse steps. No wonder he'd paid extra to end it quickly. The next morning, Clara woke to find Callahan already gone. A note scratched on a piece of bark sat on the porch. Writing fence. Back by dark. She spent the day working on the garden, which had exploded with growth after weeks of careful tending. Tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, beans climbed the poles she'd set. Squash sprawled across half the patch, their broad leaves shading the earth beneath. Clara harvested what was ready, filling a basket with vegetables that would see them through the next week. Real food, not just jerky and hardtack. She felt pride looking at that basket, pride in having grown something, having made the land productive again. She was pulling weeds from around the carrots when she heard horses approaching. Clara stood, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. 3 riders were coming up the road from town, moving at an easy pace. As they drew closer, her stomach dropped. Sheriff Hastings rode in front, his narrow face set in its usual expression of smug authority. Behind him came 2 deputies Clara recognized, men who'd laughed the loudest at the auction. She wiped her dirty hands on her pants and waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. Hastings reined his horse to a stop near the garden fence. His eyes swept over Clara, taking in her work clothes, her sun-darkened skin, the basket of vegetables at her feet. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying that oily quality she remembered. "Look at you, Miss Whitmore, playing farmer in your daddy's old pants." The deputies snickered. Clara lifted her chin. "What do you want, Sheriff?" "Just checking in," Hastings said, swinging down from his saddle. The deputies followed suit, "Making sure everything's proper out here, that you're being treated according to the terms of your contract." "I'm fine," Clara said flatly. "That's so." Hastings stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Because there's been talk in town. Talk about it not being proper. You living out here alone with a man you're not married to. Some folks think you should be brought back, placed under respectable supervision." "My contract says I work on this ranch for 5 years," Clara said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "That's what I'm doing." "Contract says you provide labor," Hastings agreed. "But there's different kinds of labor, ain't there?" His grin was nasty. "And a woman living alone with a man, well, people wonder what kind of labor you're really providing." Heat flooded Clara's face. "Get off this property." Now, Hastings said, spreading his hands in mock innocence. "No need to get hostile. We're just concerned citizens making sure the law's being followed." One of the deputies, a thick-necked man named Cooper, stepped forward. "Where's Callahan? We got questions for him, too." "He's working," Clara said. "Where?" Hastings demanded. "Riding fence." "Could be anywhere on 200 acres. Hastings' eyes glittered. "That's convenient. Leaves you here all alone, undefended." He took another step closer. "You know, we could take you back to town right now. Put you somewhere safe until we sort out whether this arrangement is legal." Clara's hands clenched into fists. "You have no right—" "I have every right," Hastings interrupted. "I'm the law in this territory, and I say what's proper and what ain't." "The sheriff's right, miss," Cooper added, moving to flank her. "This ain't no place for a decent woman. You should come with us, for your own protection." Clara looked between them, her mind racing. They couldn't just take her, could they? The contract was legal. Binding. But Hastings wore that badge like it made him untouchable, and the deputies had the look of men who enjoyed using their authority in the worst ways. She was alone. Callahan was miles away, somewhere on the property. Even if she screamed, no one would hear. "I'm not going anywhere," Clara said, hating how her voice shook. "That's the wrong answer," Hastings said, reaching for her arm. "Touch her, and you'll lose that hand." The voice came from behind the deputies, cold as winter steel. All 3 men spun around. Callahan stood 20 feet away, his horse ground-tied behind him. He must have approached from the creek side, silent as smoke. In his right hand he held a rifle, not quite aimed at the men, but not quite pointed away either. The scar on his face stood out white against his sun-darkened skin. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and just as dangerous. "Callahan," Hastings said, recovering quickly. "We were just—" "I heard what you were doing," Callahan interrupted. His voice was soft, but it carried like a threat across still water. "You were threatening a woman on my property. You were suggesting things about her character that aren't true. And you were about to put your hands on her without permission." "Now hold on," Cooper started. "You hold on," Callahan said, and something in his tone made the deputy's mouth snap shut. You came onto my land without invitation. You insulted my partner, and you threatened to take her against her will. That's 3 reasons for me to tell you to leave. I only need 1. Hastings' face flushed red. Partner? She's your bonded laborer, Callahan. Your property for 5 years. You can call it what you want, but I call it what it is, Callahan said. He moved forward, closing the distance with that same patient, inevitable stride Clara remembered from the day they met. Clara works this ranch same as me. We built those corrals together, fixed those fences together, planted that garden together. That makes her my partner. He came to stand beside Clara, not quite touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. Close enough that anyone looking could see he meant what he said. Now, Callahan continued, his voice dropping even lower, you're going to get on your horses and ride back to town. And you're going to tell anyone who asks that everything here is legal and proper and none of their damn business. You can't talk to a lawman like that, Cooper blustered. Just did. Callahan shifted his grip on the rifle, a small movement that drew every eye. And I'll do worse if you're still here in 30 seconds. Hastings' face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple. This isn't over, Callahan. The town council won't stand for this. A woman living in sin. 20 seconds, Callahan said. There are laws about proper conduct. 15. Hastings' mouth worked like a fish gasping for air. Then he spun on his heel and stalked toward his horse. Come on, he snapped at the deputies. They mounted quickly, though Cooper shot dark looks back at Callahan. You made an enemy today, Hastings called from the saddle. The town won't tolerate this. We'll be back. With more men. With authority you can't ignore. I'll be here, Callahan said simply. Hastings jerked his horse's head around and kicked it into a gallop. The deputies followed, raising a cloud of dust that hung in the still afternoon air. Clara and Callahan stood in silence until the riders disappeared over the far hill. Only then did Callahan lower the rifle. Clara's legs suddenly felt weak. She sat down hard on the garden fence, her hands shaking. You all right? Callahan asked. I thought they were going to take me, Clara said, hating how small her voice sounded. I thought there was nothing I could do to stop them. Callahan leaned the rifle against the fence and crouched down so he was eye level with her. They're not taking you anywhere. I don't care how many men they bring or what authority they think they have. This is your home. You stay here as long as you want. The contract says 5 years, Clara said bitterly. After that, contract doesn't mean anything to me, Callahan interrupted. Never did. You want to leave tomorrow? You leave. You want to stay 20 years? You stay. Your choice. Clara looked at him, really looked at him, at the scar that marked his face, at the eyes that had seen too much hardship to care about what small-minded people thought, at the hands that had worked beside hers for weeks without complaint or cruelty. Why? She asked. Why do you care what happens to me? Callahan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been old pain. Because I had a sister once who nobody defended. Nobody stood up for. And I spent 13 years wondering what happened to her, wondering if anyone cared enough to keep her safe. He stood abruptly, picking up the rifle. I can't change what happened to her, but I can make damn sure it doesn't happen to you. He walked toward the barn before Clara could respond, leaving her sitting on the fence with tears streaming down her face. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed listening to the wind and thinking about Callahan's words, thinking about a little girl lost to history, and a boy sold into brutal labor, and a man who'd turned that pain into something almost like honor. She got up and walked outside in her nightdress and bare feet. The moon was nearly full, bathing the ranch in silver light. She could see the barn clearly, could see the faint glow of Callahan's lamp through the cracks in the wall. Clara walked to the barn and knocked softly on the doorframe. Come in, Callahan's voice called. She found him sitting on his bedroll, working oil into a piece of leather harness by lamplight. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable. Can't sleep? He asked. No. Clara wrapped her arms around herself. I wanted to thank you for today, for standing up to Hastings. No thanks needed. Yes, there is. Clara moved closer. No one's ever done that for me before. My whole life I've been too big, too strong, too wrong for what a woman should be, And today you called me your partner. You told the sheriff I was worth defending. Callahan set down the harness. You are worth defending. Why? Clara's voice cracked. I'm nothing. I'm bonded labor you got stuck with when you bought this ranch. You could have just let them take me, saved yourself the trouble. You're not nothing, Callahan said, standing. And you're not trouble. You're the hardest worker I've ever known. You're strong and skilled, and you know this land better than anyone. This ranch wouldn't be coming back without you. The ranch would be fine. You could hire— I don't want to hire anyone else, Callahan interrupted. I want you here, as my partner, as my— He stopped, seeming to struggle with words for the first time since Clara had met him. As your what? Clara whispered. Callahan looked at her, and for once his eyes weren't cold or distant. They were complicated and uncertain and very, very human. I don't know yet, he said honestly, but whatever it is, it's more than a contract, more than labor. You're more than that to me. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither of them quite knew how to name. Clara took a breath. Hastings was right about one thing. The town won't let this stand. They'll come back. Maybe with the whole council, maybe with force. Let them come, Callahan said. His voice was hard again, certain. This is our land, our home. They don't get to decide what's proper or right. We do. Our land, our home. The words settled into Clara's chest like warmth. What if they bring enough men that you can't stop them? She asked. Then we'll figure something out, together. Callahan's jaw set in a way Clara had learned meant his mind was made up. I didn't buy this ranch to lose it to small-minded fools, and I didn't— He stopped again, then pushed forward. I didn't find you just to let them take you away. Find her. As if she was something valuable he'd discovered, rather than something he'd been forced to accept. Clara felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been frozen for a very long time, starting to thaw. I should go, she said, though she didn't move. Let you sleep. Clara, Callahan said as she turned toward the door, tomorrow we'll ride into the north section. Check the cattle that have been ranging wild up there. Might take all day. All right. Good. He paused. And Clara, what I said today about you being my partner, I meant it, in every way that matters. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice, and slipped back into the night. The next morning they rode out early, Clara on one of the horses they'd brought in from the wild herd, Callahan on his steady bay. The north section was rough country, rocky hills covered in scrub brush, cut through with dry washes that would run like rivers when the rains came. They found the cattle scattered across a wide valley, maybe 30 head that had survived the months of neglect. They were lean and half wild, but they were alive. We'll need to bring them in before winter, Callahan said, studying the herd from a ridge. Can't leave them out here when the snow comes. It'll take both of us to round them up, Clara said. Maybe a week of hard riding. Then we'll do it in a week. Callahan urged his horse forward. Come on, let's get a count. They spent the day riding through the hills, tallying cattle, checking for injuries or sickness. Clara moved with confidence now, her horse responding to the lightest touch. She could read the land, anticipate where the cattle would move, cut off escape routes before the animals even thought to run. Callahan watched her work with something that might have been approval. You're good at this. My father used to say I had a feel for cattle, could read them better than most men. Clara guided her horse around a small cluster of cows and calves. The town thought it was unnatural, a woman doing ranch work. The town thinks a lot of stupid things, Callahan said. He rode up beside her, matching her pace. What do you think? Clara considered the question. A month ago, she would have been uncertain, apologetic, ready to defer to someone else's judgment. But now, after weeks of hard work and small victories, after seeing what she could accomplish when given the chance, I think I'm exactly what I'm supposed to be, she said. I think this is what I was built for. Then that's all that matters, Callahan said simply. They made camp that night in the North Valley, building a small fire in a ring of stones. Callahan had brought jerky and coffee, and they ate watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of orange and red. Hastings will come back, Clara said, breaking the comfortable silence. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And he'll bring others. The whole town council, probably. They won't let this go. I know. What will you do? Callahan poked at the fire with a stick, sending up sparks. Whatever I have to, whatever keeps you safe and keeps this ranch ours. It might not be enough, Clara said quietly. They have the law on their side. They have numbers. They have... I don't care what they have, Callahan interrupted. His voice was hard as iron. They're not taking you, not taking this ranch, not taking anything we've built. I'll fight every man in Thornfield if I have to. Clara believed him. Looking at his scarred face in the firelight, at the set of his jaw and the steel in his eyes, she believed he would do exactly that. You've already fought enough, she said. 3 years in that logging camp. How many other battles since then? You don't have to fight for me, too. Callahan looked at her across the fire. Maybe I want to. The words were simple, but they carried weight Clara felt in her bones. Why? She whispered. Because you're worth fighting for, Callahan said. Because in all my years of drifting and working and surviving, I never found a place that felt like it could be home. Until now, until this ranch, until... He trailed off, looking away. Until what? Claire asked. Until you, he finished quietly. The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and fierce all at once. Clara's heart was hammering so hard she could barely breathe. Dane, she said, using his first name for the first time. I don't know what this is, what we are, but I know I don't want to lose it. Then we won't lose it, Dane said. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. They sat in silence as the fire burned down to coals and the stars emerged overhead like diamonds scattered across black velvet. And somewhere in that silence, something unspoken but undeniable settled between them. A promise, a partnership, maybe even the beginning of something more. When they rode back to the ranch the next day, Clara felt different, stronger, not just in body, but in spirit. The woman who'd stood on those courthouse steps expecting nothing but shame seemed like someone from another lifetime. That woman had been afraid, ashamed, convinced she was worthless. This woman knew her worth, knew what she could build with her own 2 hands, knew what it meant to have someone stand beside her instead of over her. And when Hastings came back, and he would come back, she would be ready. They both would be. Together. 3 days passed in careful peace. Clara and Dane worked the ranch with the rhythm they'd developed, speaking in shorthand and shared glances, moving around each other like dancers who'd learned the steps by heart. But underneath the routine, tension hummed like a wire pulled too tight. They both knew Hastings would make good on his threat. The question was when. The answer came on a Thursday morning, bright and clear, when Clara was in the garden pulling weeds from around the bean poles. She heard them before she saw them, the sound of multiple horses, the jangle of harnesses, the low murmur of male voices. Her stomach dropped. Dane, she called, standing quickly. He emerged from the barn, hammer still in hand, and followed her gaze to the road. A line of riders was approaching. Not 3 this time, but at least a dozen. At the front rode Sheriff Hastings, his narrow face set in grim determination. Beside him was Mayor Whitfield, a portly man with a gray beard and the self-important bearing of someone who enjoyed wielding power. Behind them came the town council members, recognizable even at a distance by their Sunday suits and polished boots. And flanking them on both sides rode more deputies, all armed. Stay close to me, Dane said quietly. He set down the hammer and moved to stand beside Clara, positioning himself slightly in front of her. The riders came to a halt in a semicircle around the house, effectively surrounding them. The horses stamped and snorted, stirring up dust that hung golden in the morning light. Mayor Whitfield urged his horse forward a few steps. Mr. Callahan, Miss Whitmore. His voice was formal, officious. I'm afraid we have serious business to discuss. Then discuss it from where you are, Dane said evenly. You're not welcome any closer. Whitfield's face reddened. Now see here. We represent the lawful authority of Thornfield. We have every right. You have the right to state your business, Dane interrupted. From right there. Hastings leaned forward in his saddle. Told you he'd be difficult, Mayor. Man's got no respect for proper authority. Mr. Callahan, Whitfield tried again, clearly working to keep his voice reasonable. We've come as representatives of the town council on a matter of grave moral concern. It has come to our attention that Miss Whitmore has been residing here, alone with you, unchaperoned and without proper supervision. This arrangement is highly improper and contrary to the standards of decent society. The arrangement is legal, Dane said flatly. Contract was signed, witnessed, filed with the territorial office. The contract covers labor, Councilman Porter spoke up. He was a thin man who ran the general store and had a reputation for being harder than his prices. It says nothing about living arrangements or moral conduct. She lives where she works, Dane said. Same as any ranch hand. She's not a ranch hand, Mrs. Pritchard called out. She'd ridden side saddle behind one of the deputies, her face flushed with righteous indignation. She's an unmarried woman of marriageable age, and she's living in sin with a man. It's a scandal, Mr. Callahan, an absolute scandal. The only scandal, Dane said, his voice dropping into that dangerous quiet Clara had learned to recognize, is a dozen people riding onto my property to make accusations about things that are none of their business. Whitfield held up his hand for silence. Mr. Callahan, please understand our position. We have a responsibility to maintain moral standards in our community. We have families to protect, young people to set proper examples for. This situation, a woman living alone with a man outside the bonds of matrimony, it sets a dangerous precedent. What it sets, Dane said, is an example of a woman doing honest work for honest pay. There's nothing immoral about that. To pay? Hastings snorted. She's bonded labor. You own her for 5 years. Don't dress it up as something noble. Clara felt heat flood her face, but before she could speak, Dane moved. Not violently, but with such sudden purpose that several of the horses shied back. He strode forward until he was standing directly in front of Hastings's mount. I don't own anyone, he said, each word carved from ice. Clara works this ranch because she chooses to, because it's her home, because we're partners in making this place work. The contract is just paper. It doesn't define what we are. Then what are you? Whitfield demanded. If not employer and employee, if not master and servant, what exactly is your relationship? That, Dane said, is between us. The mayor's face darkened. That's not good enough, Mr. Callahan. The town has a right to know. We have a right to ensure that unmarried women in our community are protected from what? Clara spoke up, her voice sharp. She stepped forward to stand beside Dane. From honest work? From being treated with respect? From having a home? Mrs. Pritchard's eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction. From ruination, dear. From a man taking advantage of your unfortunate circumstances. Surely you can see how this looks. How it appears to decent people. I see exactly how it appears, Claire said, her hands clenching into fists. It appears that you can't stand seeing me succeed. Can't stand that I'm not broken and begging in your gutters. You sold me on those courthouse steps like cattle, and now you're angry that the man who bought me treats me like a human being. We're trying to help you, Councilman Porter insisted. Can't you see that? We're offering you protection, respectability. Come back to town. We'll find you proper lodging with a respectable family. You can work as a domestic with proper supervision and proper moral guidance. I don't want your guidance, Clara said. I don't want your respectability. I want to be left alone to live my life. It's not that simple, Whitfield said, his voice hardening. Miss Whitmore, you need to understand your position. You're a young, unmarried woman with no family, no protection. These circumstances make you vulnerable to exploitation. It's our duty to intervene. She's not being exploited, Dane said. His voice was still quiet, still controlled, but Clara could feel the fury radiating from him like heat. She's being respected, valued, given the chance to build something with her own hands. Pretty words, Hastings said snidely, but words don't change facts. Facts are, you got a woman living under your roof with no marriage certificate, no chaperone, no proper arrangement. That makes it our business, makes it the law's business. The law, Dane said slowly, says that Clara's contract is with this ranch. Says she has the right to work here for 5 years. Doesn't say anything about where she sleeps or who supervises her morals. Actually, Whitfield said, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket, we've consulted with the territorial magistrate. According to Statute 47, subsection 12, unmarried women under bond can be removed from situations deemed morally compromising by a majority vote of the town council. He unfolded the paper with a flourish. We took that vote yesterday. It was unanimous. Clara's blood ran cold. You can't. We can, Whitfield said, almost gently. And we have. I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore, but this is for your own good. You'll come back to town with us today. We've already arranged lodging with the Reverend and Mrs. Carsworth. You'll work in their household under proper supervision until more permanent arrangements can be made. No, Clara said flatly. It's not optional, I'm afraid, Whitfield said. He gestured to two of the deputies. Gentlemen, if you would please escort Miss Whitmore to... The deputies urged their horses forward. Dane moved like lightning. One moment he was standing still, the next he had his rifle in hand, pulled from where he'd leaned it against the porch post that morning. He didn't aim it at anyone, but he held it ready, and the message was crystal clear. Don't, he said. The deputies froze. Mr. Callahan, Whitfield said, his voice shaking slightly, you're making a terrible mistake. Threatening lawmen in the execution of their duty is a serious crime. Haven't threatened anyone, Dane said. Just made it clear that no one's taking Clara anywhere. Not today. Not ever. You can't fight all of us, Hastings said, his hand moving toward his sidearm. Maybe not, Dane agreed. But I can make it costly. Real costly. Question is whether you want to pay that price over something that's none of your business in the first place. The standoff held for a long, tense moment. Clara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could feel sweat trickling down her spine despite the cool morning air. Then Dane did something Clara didn't expect. He lowered the rifle, handed it to her, and walked straight toward Whitfield's horse with nothing but his bare hands and absolute conviction. You want to talk about what's proper, he said, his voice carrying to every person in that semicircle. You want to talk about morality and respectability and doing right by people? Then let's talk about what you did to Clara on those courthouse steps. Whitfield shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. That was a legal auction, properly conducted. That was public humiliation, Dane cut him off. You sold a woman like livestock, let a crowd mock her and demean her and treat her like she was worth less than the dirt they walked on. Where was your moral concern then? The circumstances were unfortunate, Whitfield said stiffly, but legal debts had to be settled. Debts could have been settled privately, Dane said, could have been handled with discretion and dignity, but you made it a spectacle, made it entertainment. And when nobody bid, when she stood there unwanted and humiliated, where was the town council's compassion then? Where was your offer of respectable lodging and proper care? Several of the council members had the grace to look ashamed. That's different, Mrs. Pritchard protested weakly. That was a matter of legal procedure. It was cruelty, Dane said flatly, dressed up as law. And now you want to repeat it by dragging her back to town against her will, putting her under the control of people who've already proven they see her as less than human. We're trying to protect her reputation, Porter argued. Her reputation? Dane's laugh was bitter. You destroyed her reputation the day you put her on auction. Don't pretend this is about protecting her. This is about controlling her, about making sure she knows her place and stays in it. Clara felt something crack open inside her chest. No one had ever defended her like this. No one had ever put words to the injustice she'd felt but couldn't articulate. Dane was fighting for her, not with violence, but with truth, and it was more powerful than any weapon. Mr. Callahan, Whitfield said, clearly struggling to regain control of the situation, your passion is noted, but it doesn't change the facts. Miss Whitmore's living situation is improper. The council has voted. The law is clear. Then change it, Clara said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. She stepped forward, still holding Dane's rifle but letting it point at the ground. You say the law requires me to be under proper supervision. Fine. Then supervise this. She turned to look at Dane, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. What if I wasn't unmarried? Dane's eyes widened slightly. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked surprised. Clara, he said quietly, you don't have to. What if I married him? Clara said, louder now, addressing the whole crowd. Would that satisfy your moral concerns? Would that make it proper enough for your respectable sensibilities? Whitfield blinked. Well, that would certainly change the legal situation. A married woman living with her husband is perfectly proper, but Mr. Callahan hasn't proposed, Mrs. Pritchard said, triumph creeping into her voice. Has he, dear? Has this man who claims to value you so much actually offered you marriage? Or has he just been content to keep you here in this arrangement? Clara felt the question like a knife, because Mrs. Pritchard was right. For all Dane's talk of partnership and respect, for all the ways he'd defended her, he'd never once mentioned marriage, never suggested making their situation permanent and legal in the eyes of the world. Maybe because he didn't want to. Maybe because she was still just bonded labor to him, useful but not worth keeping beyond the contract terms. The thought hurt more than Clara expected. She turned to Dane, preparing to see confirmation of her worst fears in his face. Instead, she saw him looking at her with an expression she'd never seen before. His eyes weren't cold or distant. They were warm and uncertain and almost afraid. Clara, he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. I never asked because I didn't think you'd want me. Didn't think a woman like you would choose a man like me if she had any other option. Clara's breath caught. What? Dane stepped closer, ignoring the entire audience of town officials and busybodies. You're strong and capable, and could have any life you wanted. Could leave here tomorrow and build something anywhere. Why would you tie yourself to a scarred-up drifter with no family and a past full of hard labor and harder choices? Because, Clara said, tears suddenly streaming down her face, you're the only person who ever saw me as something other than a burden or a joke. Because you work beside me instead of over me. Because you defend me when I can't defend myself. Because you make me feel like I matter. The silence that fell was absolute. Even the horses seemed to hold still. Dane reached out slowly and took Clara's hand. His palm was calloused and scarred, but his touch was gentle. I bought this ranch because I needed land, he said quietly. But I'd give it all up before I'd let them take you. You're worth more than 200 acres, more than gold, more than anything I've ever had or ever will have. He went down on one knee right there in the dirt, in front of the whole town council, in front of everyone who'd ever mocked or dismissed or diminished either of them. Clara Whitmore, he said, looking up at her with those winter-gray eyes that had become the most familiar thing in her world. Will you marry me? Not because of contracts or laws or what these people think is proper, but because I want you as my partner in every way. Because I choose you, and because I hope, his voice cracked slightly, because I hope you might choose me too. Clara looked down at him. At this man who'd paid $900 to end her humiliation, who'd carried her to bed when she collapsed, who'd taught her carpentry and defended her honor and never once made her feel small. She thought about the woman she'd been on those courthouse steps, broken and ashamed and convinced she was worthless. And she thought about the woman she was now, strong and capable and finally certain of her own value. Yes, she said, her voice clear and steady despite the tears. Yes, I'll marry you. Dane stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight enough that Clara could feel his heart hammering against her cheek. Behind them, someone cleared their throat. They broke apart to find Reverend Carsworth urging his horse forward. He was an older man with kind eyes and a gentle manner, one of the few people in town who'd never treated Clara with cruelty. Well, he said, a small smile playing at his lips, I suppose if there's to be a wedding, you'll need someone to perform the ceremony. Reverend, Whitfield protested, you can't seriously be suggesting we conduct a marriage right here, right now, without proper preparation or— Why not? Carsworth interrupted mildly. You came here demanding propriety. They're offering you matrimony. Seems like a fair solution to me. But there are procedures, Porter sputtered. Paperwork, witnesses. A proper ceremony requires 2 willing parties and a man of faith to speak the words, Carsworth said. He dismounted with the stiffness of age and walked toward Clara and Dane. Everything else is just decoration. He stopped in front of them, his eyes moving between their faces. Are you both certain? Marriage is a serious commitment, not to be entered into lightly or under pressure. I'm certain, Dane said immediately. Clara met the Reverend's kind gaze and felt peace settle over her like a blanket. So am I. Carsworth nodded. Then I'd be honored to perform the ceremony. He turned to face the assembled crowd. You wanted witnesses? There's your witnesses, the whole town council, and then some. Hastings looked like he'd swallowed something sour. Mrs. Pritchard's face had gone red with frustrated indignation, but Whitfield, to his credit, nodded slowly. Very well, he said. If Miss Whitmore consents freely, and if marriage is offered in good faith, then the council's moral concerns are satisfied. He shot a warning look at Hastings. Isn't that right, Sheriff? Hastings' jaw worked. Suppose so, though it seems mighty convenient. Convenient or not, it's legal and proper, Whitfield said firmly. He clearly wanted this situation resolved before it escalated into actual violence. Proceed, Reverend. Carsworth positioned himself facing Clara and Dane. Join hands, he said gently. Clara placed her hands in Dane's, feeling the rough calluses, the scars, the strength that had built so much alongside her. Marriage, Carsworth began, his voice carrying across the yard, is a partnership, a joining of two lives into one shared journey. It requires trust, respect, and the willingness to stand together against whatever challenges come. He looked at Dane. Dane Callahan, do you take this woman to be your wife? To stand beside her, to protect and honor her, to build a life with her for as long as you both shall live? I do, Dane said, his voice absolutely certain. Carsworth turned to Clara. Clara Whitmore, do you take this man to be your husband? To stand beside him, to respect and honor him, to build a life with him for as long as you both shall live? Clara looked into Dane's eyes and saw her future, saw years of working this land together, of building something real and lasting, of finally belonging somewhere not as property or burden, but as partner and equal. I do, she said, her voice strong. Then by the authority vested in me, Carsworth said, smiling now, I pronounce you husband and wife. What has been joined here, let no one separate. He paused, then added with a twinkle in his eye, you may kiss your bride. Dane pulled Clara close and kissed her there in the dusty ranch yard, in front of the whole town council, in front of everyone who'd ever doubted or dismissed them. Clara kissed him back, tasting salt from her own tears, and feeling something shift fundamentally in the universe. She was no longer Clara Whitmore, the unwanted daughter, the bonded laborer, the woman too big and wrong for the world's expectations. She was Clara Callahan, wife, partner, builder of her own destiny. When they finally broke apart, Carsworth was beaming. Congratulations, he said warmly. May you have many happy years together. Thank you, Reverend, Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. Carsworth turned to Whitfield. I trust this satisfies the council's concerns? Whitfield looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. Yes. Yes, I suppose it does. He gathered his reins. Mrs. Callahan, that is, the council wishes you well in your marriage. It was a grudging blessing at best, but Clara would take it. One by one, the council members turned their horses and began riding back toward town. Some looked relieved, some disappointed, some simply confused by how quickly the situation had resolved. Mrs. Pritchard was the last to leave, her face pinched with displeasure. This isn't over, she said quietly as she passed. Decent people will remember how this started. Will remember what you are. A married woman on her own land, Clara said calmly. That's what I am. Mrs. Pritchard sniffed and rode away. Hastings lingered a moment longer, his hand resting on his sidearm. You got lucky today, Callahan, but luck runs out. Wasn't luck, Dane said. Was choosing to do the right thing. You might try it sometime. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, but he wheeled his horse around and galloped after the others without another word. Soon it was just Clara, Dane, and Reverend Carsworth standing in the yard. The dust was settling. The morning was growing warm, and everything had changed. I should be getting back, Carsworth said, but I'll file the marriage certificate properly in town. Make sure everything's legal and recorded. Thank you, Dane said, shaking the Reverend's hand. For everything. Carsworth mounted his horse with some difficulty. Take care of each other, he said, and don't let the town's judgment weigh on you. What you've built here is good and honest. That's what matters. He rode away slowly, leaving Clara and Dane alone. They stood in silence for a long moment, hands still clasped, processing what had just happened. "We're married," Clara said finally, the words feeling strange and wonderful in her mouth. "We're married," Dane agreed. He looked almost dazed. "I didn't plan that. This morning I woke up thinking we'd have to fight them off. Didn't expect to end the day with a wife." Clara laughed, the sound bubbling up unexpectedly. "I didn't expect to end the day with a husband, but I'm glad I did." Dane pulled her close again, resting his chin on top of her head. "I meant what I said. Every word. You're worth more than this ranch, more than anything." "I know," Clara said, and realized she did know, believed it finally, not just in her head, but in her heart. "And you're worth more than you think you are, too." They stood like that, holding each other in the morning sun, on the land they'd rebuilt together. Clara Callahan. The name felt right. Felt like coming home. Like finally, after years of being told she was too much or not enough, she'd found the exact right size. The perfect fit. And it had been there all along, waiting in the form of a scarred stranger who'd seen her worth when no one else could. They stood holding each other until the dust from the departing horses settled completely, until the sound of hoofbeats faded into silence, until the world was just the two of them and the land stretching out in every direction. Finally, Dane stepped back, his hand still resting on Clara's shoulders. "You know we don't have to do this," he said quietly. "The marriage. We can tell Carsworth not to file the certificate. Say it was just for show, to get them off our backs." Clara looked at him, at the scar on his face, and the uncertainty in his eyes. "Is that what you want?" "No," Dane said immediately. "But I want you to have a choice. Real choice. Not just choosing me because it was the only way to stay on your own land." Clara reached up and touched his face, her calloused fingers tracing the line of that old scar. "I didn't choose you to stay on the land, Dane. I chose you because you're the first person who ever made me feel like I was enough exactly as I am. Because when I'm with you, I'm not too big or too strong or too anything. I'm just right." Dane caught her hand and pressed it against his cheek. "You've always been just right. The world was just too small to see it." "Then we'll build a bigger world," Clara said, "right here, together." He kissed her again, softer this time, and Clara felt something settle deep in her bones. This was real. This was permanent. This was home. When they broke apart, Dane glanced toward the barn. "I should probably move my things into the house. Seems wrong for a husband to sleep in the barn on his wedding day." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "There's only one real bed. My father's room has the good mattress. My room just has a cot." "Then we'll share the good bed," Dane said simply. "If that's all right with you." Clara nodded, suddenly shy despite everything they'd been through together. "It's more than all right." They spent the afternoon in quiet domesticity that felt strange and wonderful. Dane moved his few belongings from the barn to the main house. A bedroll, a pack with clothes, a few tools, a battered book Clara had never seen him read. It took less than an hour because he traveled light, carried nothing he didn't need. Clara cleaned her father's room, their room now, with care. Changed the sheets, swept the floor, opened the windows to let in fresh air and sunlight. The room had sat empty since her father died, and she'd avoided it, unable to face the memories. But now, filling it with Dane's presence, it felt less like a shrine to the past and more like a foundation for the future. That evening, they made dinner together in the kitchen. Clara chopped vegetables from the garden while Dane prepared a chicken he'd slaughtered that morning. They moved around each other easily, falling into the rhythm they'd developed over weeks of shared work. "I've been thinking," Dane said as he turned the chicken on the spit, "about the cattle in the north section. We should bring them in soon. Get them closer to the barn before winter hits." "That'll take at least a week," Clara said. "Maybe 2 if we do it right. Round them up, sort them, get them settled in the near pastures. We'll need to repair the near pastures first. Some of those fences won't hold determined cattle." Clara smiled. Even on their wedding day, they were planning ranch work. It should have felt unromantic, but instead it felt perfect. This was their life. This was what they'd built and would keep building.
They ate dinner on the porch as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. The air was cooling, carrying the first hint of autumn. In another month, the leaves would turn. In 2 months, the first frost would come. "We'll need to lay in supplies before the snows," Clara said. "Flour, salt, coffee, ammunition for hunting."
Maybe some lumber for repairs we can't do once the ground freezes. That means going into town, Dane said carefully. Clara tensed. She hadn't thought about that. Eventually, they'd have to face Thornfield again, face the people who'd tried to drag her away just that morning. "They'll talk," she said quietly. "They'll say terrible things." "Let them talk," Dane replied. "We know the truth. That's what matters." Is it enough? Knowing the truth when everyone else believes lies? Dane set down his plate and turned to face her fully. "Clara, I spent 3 years in a logging camp where men believed I was nothing but a body to work until it broke. Spent years after that drifting, listening to people make judgments about what kind of man I was based on this scar, or my rough hands, or the fact that I had no family name to claim. And I learned something important." "What?" "That other people's opinions don't put food on your table, don't fix your fences or raise your cattle, or give you a place to belong. The only opinions that matter are the ones from people who actually know you, who see you clear." He took her hand. "You see me clear, I see you clear. Everyone else can think whatever they want." Clara squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his certainty. "When do you want to go to town?" "Give it a week," Dane said. "Let things settle. Let them get used to the idea that we're married and not going anywhere. Then we'll go in together, get what we need, and come home. Together." The word warmed Clara from the inside out. That night, lying beside Dane in the darkness of their shared room, Clara stared at the ceiling and marveled at how much had changed. 2 months ago, she'd walked toward the courthouse expecting nothing but shame and loss. Now she lay in her own house, on her own land, beside a man who'd chosen her not out of pity or obligation, but because he saw her worth. "You awake?" Dane's voice came soft through the darkness. "Yes." "Thinking about today?" "Thinking about everything," Clara said. "About how none of this went the way I expected." She felt Dane shift, turning toward her. "Is that good or bad?" "Good," Clara said immediately. "Definitely good. Just strange. I thought my life was over when my father died. Thought I'd end up broken and alone, property of whatever man was cruel enough or desperate enough to bid on me. Instead, you got me," Dane said. "Not sure if that's better or worse." Clara turned to face him, able to make out his features in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. "It's better. So much better than anything I could have imagined." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "I'm glad you think so, because I plan on keeping you for a very long time, Clara Callahan." Clara Callahan. The name still sent a thrill through her. "How long?" she asked, feeling bold in the darkness. "Rest of my life," Dane said simply. "If that's acceptable to you." "More than acceptable," Clara whispered. He kissed her then, and Clara felt the last walls around her heart finally crumble. This man had bought her freedom, taught her strength, defended her honor, and chosen to bind his life to hers. Not because he had to, because he wanted to, because somehow, impossibly, he loved her, and she loved him back with a fierceness that surprised her. The week passed in hard work and quiet contentment. They repaired the near pastures, reinforcing fences and clearing brush, made lists of supplies they'd need before winter, worked on the barn roof, replacing shingles before the autumn rains began. On the 8th day, they saddled horses and rode toward Thornfield. Clara's stomach churned as the town came into view. She hadn't been back since the auction, and riding down that main street again felt like walking into a courtroom for sentencing. But Dane rode beside her, steady and solid, and that made all the difference. They tied their horses outside the general store. Porter stood behind the counter when they entered, and his eyes widened slightly at the sight of them. "Mr. Callahan, Mrs. Callahan." He said the title carefully, like he was testing how it felt in his mouth. "We need supplies," Dane said, pulling out the list they'd made. "Can you fill this?" Porter took the list and scanned it quickly. "I can have everything ready by tomorrow. Need to order in some of the hardware you're asking for." "Tomorrow's fine," Dane said. Porter hesitated, then said awkwardly, "I want to apologize for last week,
for riding out with the council. It was wrong, interfering in your private business like that. Clara stared at him in surprise. An apology was the last thing she'd expected.
We were concerned, Porter continued, not meeting their eyes. Genuinely concerned, but we went about it the wrong way. Should have talked to you directly instead of riding in like we were conducting a raid. Yes, you should have, Dane said bluntly. Porter flushed but nodded. My wife pointed that out, rather forcefully, said we acted like bullies instead of neighbors. He finally looked up at Clara. She wanted me to tell you she's sorry too. Says any woman strong enough to run a ranch deserves respect, not harassment. Clara felt tears prick her eyes unexpectedly. Thank you. Tell her I appreciate that. I will. Porter cleared his throat. Your order will be ready by noon tomorrow. Will that work? That'll work fine, Dane said. They left the store and walked down the main street. People stared. Of course they stared. But Clara kept her head high. She was done apologizing for existing. They were passing this courthouse when Sheriff Hastings emerged, stopping dead when he saw them. Callahan, Mrs. Callahan, and he said it grudgingly, like the title tasted sour. Sheriff, Dane said evenly. Hastings' hand rested on his gun belt, not quite threatening, but not friendly either. Heard you two are making a go of it. The ranch. We are, Clara said firmly. Well, Hastings seemed to struggle with what to say next. I suppose I should tell you there have been no further complaints. Council voted to leave you alone so long as everything stays legal and proper. It is legal, Dane said, and it's as proper as we choose to make it. Hastings' jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly and stepped aside to let them pass. They continued down the street, aware of whispers following in their wake. Some looks were hostile, some curious, some openly pitying. Clara ignored them all. They were almost back to their horses when a woman's voice called out, Clara! Clara Callahan! Clara turned to see Martha Tucker hurrying toward them, her pretty face flushed. She was the one who'd mocked Clara so cruelly at the auction, talking about how no one would want her. Clara braced herself for more cruelty. Instead, Martha stopped in front of them and said breathlessly, I'm sorry, I need to say I'm sorry. Clara blinked. What? For what I said at the auction. About you not being wanted, about you being too big, all those terrible things. Martha's eyes were bright with unshed tears. It was cruel and petty, and I'm ashamed of myself. My husband reminded me that I used to be just like you, alone and scared and worried no one would want me. And instead of showing compassion, I used your pain to make myself feel better. Clara didn't know what to say. She'd expected many things from this trip to town, but genuine apologies weren't among them. I know sorry doesn't fix it, Martha continued, but I wanted you to know that not everyone in Thornfield is proud of how we treated you. Some of us are deeply ashamed. Thank you, Clara managed. That means more than you know. Martha nodded, wiped her eyes, and hurried away. Dane watched her go, then looked at Clara. You all right? Clara realized she was smiling. I'm fine. Better than fine. I think maybe the town is starting to see things differently. Maybe, Dane agreed, or maybe they're just realizing they were wrong and don't want to admit it directly. They mounted their horses and rode out of Thornfield. As they crested the hill that led to the ranch, Clara looked back at the town one more time. It looked smaller than she remembered, less important. Her life wasn't there anymore. It was on the land ahead of them, in the house they were making into a home, in the work they did side by side. The next day they returned for the supplies. Porter had everything ready as promised, and several townspeople stopped to offer congratulations on their marriage, some sincere, some obligatory, but all acknowledging the reality of their union. As they loaded the wagon, Reverend Carsworth approached with a leather-bound book. I filed the marriage certificate, he said, handing the book to Clara. This is your copy. Keep it safe. Clara opened it and saw their names written in careful script. Dane Callahan and Clara Whitmore, Callahan, married on the 23rd of September in the year of our Lord 1874. Thank you, Reverend, she said softly. Carsworth smiled. Build a good life together. That's thanks enough. The ride home was quiet but comfortable. The wagon was heavy with supplies, and the horses took their time. Clara sat beside Dane, their shoulders touching with the sway of the wagon, and felt peace settle over her like a warm blanket. When they reached the ranch, the sun was setting, turning everything gold and orange. They unloaded the wagon together, then tended the horses, then sat on the porch to watch the last light fade from the sky. "Tomorrow we start on the cattle," Dane said. "Bring in the northern herd before the weather turns." "It'll be hard work," Clara said. "Best kind of work there is." Clara leaned against his shoulder. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been at that auction? If you hadn't bought the ranch?" Dane was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes. But then I remember I was there. I did buy it. And trying to imagine a different path seems like a waste of time when this one turned out so right." "Is it right?" Clara asked. "Even though it started with me being sold like property?" "It's right despite how it started," Dane said. "Maybe even because of how it started. If things had been different, if you'd had money, if I'd met you some other way, maybe we would have never given each other a chance. Maybe you would have seen just a scarred drifter, and I would have seen just another woman too worried about what people thought to take a risk. And instead we saw each other, really saw each other. Not despite the hard circumstances, but because of them. We were both stripped down to what mattered, so we recognized it when we found it." Clara thought about that. Thought about how her father's death and the debts and the auction had broken her down to nothing, how Dane's past had done the same to him, and how, in that brokenness, they'd found the strength to build something new. "I'm glad you were there," she said quietly. "I'm glad you bought me." "I didn't buy you," Dane corrected gently. "I bought your freedom. And you chose what to do with it." "I chose you." "Best choice either of us ever made," Dane said, kissing the top of her head. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm of hard work and small joys. They brought in the northern cattle, spending 12-hour days in the saddle, rounding up the half-wild herd. Clara proved as good on horseback as she was on foot, cutting off escapes and driving the cattle with skill her father had taught her. Dane watched her work with open admiration. "You're a natural," he said one evening as they camped under the stars. The herd settled for the night. "My father always said I had a gift for reading animals," Clara replied. "Said I could think like a cow, which the town considered proof I was more animal than woman." "The town," Dane said, "is full of people who wouldn't know a gift if it bit them. Their loss." They got the cattle settled in the near pastures, sorted the breeding stock from the steers they'd sell in spring, and counted heads. 43 total. Not a fortune, but enough to build on. "We'll need a bull," Dane said, studying the herd. "These cows are good stock, but without a quality bull to breed them to, we won't improve the herd." "There's a rancher 2 counties over who raises prize Herefords," Clara said. "My father talked about buying breeding stock from him, but never had the money. We could ride over, see what he's got." "We'll do that come spring," Dane agreed. "For now, we focus on getting through winter." October brought cooler weather and the first light frosts. They worked on winterizing the ranch, banking earth around the foundation to keep cold air from getting under the house, splitting wood for the stove and fireplace, smoking meat, and storing vegetables in the root cellar. One afternoon, Clara was pulling the last of the carrots when she heard a horse approaching. She straightened, shading her eyes, and saw a lone rider coming up the road. As the figure drew closer, Clara's breath caught. It was Mrs. Pritchard. Clara set down her basket and waited, unsure what to expect. The woman had been among the most vocal critics of Clara's living situation, had ridden out with the council to try and force her back to town. Mrs. Pritchard reined her horse to a stop and dismounted with some difficulty. Up close, she looked older than Clara remembered, her face lined with more than just age. "Mrs. Callahan," she said formally. "Mrs. Pritchard," Clara replied, equally formal. The older woman cleared her throat. "I came to apologize, and to bring you this." She pulled a bundle wrapped in brown paper from her saddlebag. Clara took it cautiously and unwrapped it. Inside was a beautiful quilt, hand-stitched in a pattern of interlocking rings. "It's a wedding quilt," Mrs. Pritchard said. "Traditional gift for new brides. I should have brought it weeks ago, but—" She trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Thank you," Clara said, genuinely touched. "It's beautiful." "My mother taught me the pattern," Mrs. Pritchard said. "She called it the wedding ring design. Symbolizes 2 lives joined together." She paused, then added quietly,
I was wrong about you, Clara. Wrong about a lot of things. Clara waited, sensing there was more. My daughter ran away 3 years ago, Mrs. Pritchard said, the words coming out like they hurt. Ran off with a traveling salesman because she said I was too strict, too controlling, too concerned with what people thought. I haven't heard from her since. I'm sorry, Clara said softly. I see now that I tried to do the same thing to you, tried to control your choices because I was afraid of what people would say, what they would think. And in doing so, I nearly drove you away from a good man and a good life. Mrs. Pritchard's eyes glistened. I don't know where my daughter is or if she's happy, but I know you're here, and you've found something real.
And I want you to know that I'm glad, truly glad. Clara felt her own eyes filling with tears. Would you like to come in, have some coffee? Mrs. Pritchard looked surprised, then grateful. I'd like that very much. They sat at the kitchen table, the table Clara's father had built, that Clara and Dane had cleaned and repaired together, and talked, really talked, like two women instead of critic and victim. Mrs. Pritchard spoke about her daughter, about the regrets that kept her awake at night. Clara spoke about her father, about the ranch, about building a life with Dane. When Mrs. Pritchard finally left 2 hours later, she hugged Clara at the door. Thank you, she said, for giving an old fool a second chance. Thank you for the quilt, Clara replied, and for the apology. That night, Clara and Dane spread the wedding quilt over their bed. It fit perfectly, the interlocking rings seeming to glow in the lamplight. That was kind of her, Dane said. And brave. Not easy to admit when you're wrong.
No, Clara agreed, but I'm glad she did. It feels like maybe the town is finally seeing us differently, not as a scandal, but as just us. About time, Dane said. He pulled Clara close. Though I don't need their approval. I've got everything I need right here. Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. So do I. November brought the first real snow. They woke one morning to find the world transformed, everything covered in a blanket of white that sparkled in the sunlight. The ranch looked beautiful, peaceful, like something from a dream. They worked through the winter together, feeding cattle, mending equipment, keeping the home fires burning. On the coldest nights, they sat by the fireplace and Dane read aloud from his battered book. Poetry, it turned out, verses about nature and struggle and finding beauty in hard places. I didn't know you liked poetry, Clara said one evening. My mother used to write it, Dane replied, before she died, before everything fell apart. I kept this book as a reminder of her. Will you tell me about her? Clara asked gently. So Dane told her. About a woman who'd loved words and music, who'd done her best to raise 2 children alone after their father died, who'd worked herself to exhaustion trying to keep them fed, who'd finally succumbed to fever when Dane was 15, leaving him and his sister to fend for themselves. That's when the debts caught up with us, Dane said quietly. I tried to work, tried to pay them off, but I was just a boy, and the interest kept climbing. Eventually, they took me to the logging camp and sent my sister to an orphanage. Have you ever tried to find her? Clara asked. Spent years looking, Dane said. Wrote letters, asked at every orphanage and settlement I passed. Never found a trace. She'd be 20 now, grown. Probably doesn't even remember me. Clara took his hand. Maybe someday you'll find her, or she'll find you. Maybe, Dane said, though he sounded doubtful. But even if I never do, at least I found you. Found a place to belong. Christmas came quietly. They had no decorations, no fancy dinner, but Clara made a venison roast with vegetables from the cellar, and Dane surprised her with a gift, a beautiful leather-bound journal. For recording the ranch business, he said, cattle counts, breeding records, expenses. Figured we should keep proper books. Clara opened it and saw that he'd already written on the first page in his careful script, Callahan Ranch, established 1874. Partners, Dane Callahan and Clara Callahan. Partners, equal names on equal ground. It's perfect, Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you. She gave him a gift too, a new shirt she'd sewn from fabric she'd bought secretly on their last trip to town. It fit him perfectly,
and he wore it to the small gathering at Reverend Carsworth's house on Christmas Day, where they shared dinner with the handful of townspeople who genuinely embraced their marriage. Porter was there with his wife, a kind woman who apologized profusely for her husband's role in the council visit. Martha Tucker came with her husband, bringing gifts of preserves and bread. Even Sheriff Hastings showed up, though he stayed quiet and left early. It wasn't much. It wasn't the whole town welcoming them with open arms. But it was something. It was acceptance, grudging though it might be. As they rode home through the snow that evening, Clara felt contentment settle deep in her bones. "Happy?" Dane asked. "Happier than I ever thought I could be," Clara replied truthfully. Winter deepened, then began to break. The snow melted in March, revealing brown grass that would soon turn green. The cattle grew restless, sensing spring. Clara and Dane made plans for the year ahead, planting, breeding, buying that bull, maybe hiring seasonal help for the heavy work. One warm afternoon in early April, they were working on the garden plot when a lone rider appeared on the horizon. Clara shaded her eyes, unable to make out who it was. But something about the way the person sat the horse, straight-backed but uncertain, made her heart beat faster. As the rider drew closer, Clara saw it was a young woman, maybe 20 years old, with dark hair and a thin face. She wore a worn traveling coat and carried a small bag tied to her saddle. The woman reined her horse to a stop at the edge of the yard. She looked between Clara and Dane, her eyes settling on Dane's face. "I'm looking for Dane Callahan," she said, her voice shaking slightly. Dane stood slowly, setting down his shovel. "I'm Dane Callahan." The woman dismounted on trembling legs. She took a step forward, then another, her eyes never leaving Dane's face. "I don't know if you remember me," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's been 13 years. But I'm Sarah Callahan. Your sister." Dane went absolutely still. For a moment he didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't move at all. Then he crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and pulled his sister into his arms, holding her like he'd never let go. Sarah sobbed against his chest, her small frame shaking. "I've been looking for you for 2 years, asked everywhere. Finally, someone in Thornfield said a Dane Callahan had bought a ranch outside town. I prayed it was you." "It's me," Dane said, his voice breaking. "It's me. You found me." Clara stood back, tears running down her own face, watching the reunion she'd hoped for but never quite believed would happen. Eventually they separated enough for Dane to look at his sister properly. "You're so grown up," he said wonderingly. "Last time I saw you, you were a little girl." "Last time I saw you, they were dragging you away in chains," Sarah said, her voice bitter. "I tried to stop them, tried to hold on to you, but I was too small." "It wasn't your fault," Dane said firmly. "None of it was your fault." He turned to Clara. "Sarah, this is my wife." "Clara." Sarah looked at Clara with red-rimmed eyes. "Your wife?" "Clara Callahan," Clara said, stepping forward and offering her hand. "It's wonderful to meet you." Sarah took her hand, then surprised Clara by pulling her into a hug. "Thank you," she whispered, "for whatever you've given my brother, for the peace I see in his eyes that was never there before." That night they sat around the kitchen table and shared stories. Sarah told them about the orphanage, about running away when she turned 16, about working as a seamstress and a cook, and anything else she could find while searching for her brother. Dane told her about the logging camp, about the years of drifting, about finding this ranch and the woman who'd become his partner. "Will you stay?" Clara asked when the stories wound down. "We have room, and we could use the help if you're willing to work." Sarah looked between them, hope and uncertainty warring on her face. "I don't want to impose—" "You're not imposing," Dane said firmly. "You're family. This is your home if you want it." Sarah started crying again. I want it so much." And so the Callahan Ranch gained another partner. Sarah proved to be hardworking and skilled, with a gift for sewing and cooking that complemented Clara's ranching abilities and Dane's carpentry. The 3 of them settled into a rhythm, building something that felt like the family none of them had had for too long. By summer, the ranch was thriving. The cattle were healthy and breeding well. The garden produced more vegetables than they could eat, and they started selling the surplus in town. Sarah's skill with a needle meant she could repair clothes and gear,
saving them money and time. The town had fully accepted them by then, not with enthusiasm, perhaps, but with the grudging respect that came from watching them succeed against the odds. When Dane and Clara rode into Thornfield, people nodded in greeting. When Sarah accompanied them, she was introduced politely and welcomed into the stores. One afternoon in late August, Clara stood on the porch and looked out over the ranch. The house was in perfect repair now, freshly painted and solid. The barn stood straight and strong. The corrals held healthy cattle. The garden overflowed with life. Everything her father had built and lost, she had rebuilt. Everything the town had tried to take from her, she had reclaimed. And she'd gained so much more than she'd lost. Dane came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "About how far we've come," Clara said. "About the woman who stood on those courthouse steps expecting nothing but shame." "She was strong even then," Dane said. "Just didn't know it yet." "No," Clara agreed. "She didn't. But she learned." They stood together in silence, watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant colors. Sarah emerged from the barn, waving to them before heading to the garden to pick vegetables for dinner. This was home. This was family. This was everything Clara had never dared to hope for. A year ago, she'd been nothing. Property to be sold to the highest bidder, worth less than the land she stood on. Now she was Clara Callahan, wife, rancher, sister, partner, owner of her own destiny and builder of her own future. The woman who'd been sold had become the woman who chose. And in choosing, she'd found not just survival but joy. Not just endurance, but love. Not just a place to exist, but a place to truly, finally belong. Dane squeezed her gently. "Ready for dinner?" Clara turned in his arms and kissed him, tasting home and happiness and hope. "Ready," she said. Together they walked inside, into the house they'd built with their own hands, on the land they'd reclaimed together toward the life they'd chosen against all odds. Behind them, the sun set over the Callahan ranch, painting everything in gold. And Clara Callahan, once unwanted, once sold, once broken, smiled. Because she had won. Not by defeating her enemies or proving her worth to people who'd never valued her, but by building something so beautiful, so strong, so real that their opinions simply stopped mattering. She had won by choosing herself, by choosing love, by choosing to keep building even when everything seemed lost. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered, the only victory that ever would.